President Biden has bold plans for his economic agenda, but getting the legislation through Congress will not be easy. He introduced the first part of that agenda on Wednesday, a $2 trillion proposal to upgrade the nation's infrastructure. To pay for it, the White House wants to raise taxes on corporations, higher income earners, and investors. Mr. Biden's economic vision would cause federal spending to take up a larger share of the American economy. It's an approach the president says he sees as a throwback to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. For more on all this, I'm joined by Jake Schlesinger. Jake is a senior Washington correspondent for the Wall Street Journal and co-author of the article behind Biden's big plans, Belief that Government Can Drive Growth. Jake, good to have you here. Let's get right into it. The federal debt is at levels not seen since World War II. Nearly $5 trillion have already been spent this past year in coronavirus relief. So why does the Biden administration feel like more government spending is the answer?
Well, first, thank you for having me. To boil it down, two reasons. One is, as you noted in your introduction, they do intend to try and pay for at least some part of the plan with higher taxes. And so in their view, this is not something that will further escalate the debt and the deficit. But another is that there are structural changes to the economy, a lot of economists think so, that mean that higher government borrowing doesn't lead to higher interest rates the way they used to. You may remember James Carville, one of Bill Clinton's advisors in the early 1990s, used to joke that if he died, he wanted to be reincarnated as the bond market because it could intimidate everybody through the threat of higher interest rates. The bond market doesn't scare people anymore.
Well, President Biden's plan opposes the Reagan-era belief that government is the problem. And as you write, two of the longest economic expansions in U.S. history followed President Reagan's policies. How is today's economy different? Could it benefit from government involvement?
So some of this is ideological, of course, and I think, a lot of conservatives would disagree with this assertion. But I think that two main lessons that at least progressives say that they have learned from the Reagan policies and even the periods of growth that you referenced. One is that growth has come with a significant increase in inequality, greater gaps in income, greater gaps certainly in wealth. And so that while you've had big growth, the prosperity has not been shared as broadly as it had been before. And secondly, you've had a great period of instability, certainly in this century. You may have seen the great Saturday Night Live skit on Boomers Get the Vax, where one of the comedians right. says in the intro, the Boomers, we crashed the economy 3 whole times. Well, we had the financial crisis in 2008, 2009. Which was a traumatic experience. And even though we recovered from that, you now had the pandemic and the great disruptions. And I think what the conclusion is, again, at least among progressives, is, look, government may have caused some of the problems and some of the that we saw in the 1970s, but the lack of government action has created a whole range of new problems that cannot be solved by the private sector.
Jake, it's interesting, too, as I had a former economist with the Clinton administration on the show yesterday. And one of the interesting things talking to him that I was reminded of is that the Clinton administration placed a priority on bringing down the national debt. Obviously, with the last two administrations, that same philosophy has not been shared. Can you talk to us a little bit about how the Biden administration is approaching that question, as well as how President Biden's philosophy on economics have changed over the years?
It's interesting. You, in your introduction, talked about his new infrastructure plan, the American Jobs Plan. A couple days after that, or a week or so after that, he introduced his new budget proposals broadly for the next fiscal year. And one of the things that they said was, and this was in some ways a slap both at Trump and at Obama, was that the government has been underspending the last 10 years with caps on spending for everything outside of defense, and that they are now proposing pretty big increases in government spending. And so that is a shift. Biden himself was a supporter of a lot of the Clinton proposals that you mentioned. He voted for the Reagan tax cuts in 1981. He often talked about limiting Social Security and Medicare because he was concerned about government spending getting out of control. In the Clinton administration, he actually voted for a constitutional amendment to balance the budget. Those are all things that you don't hear President Biden talking about right now. He's shifted partly because the economy has changed for the reasons that we've discussed, partly because the politics have changed. I think for the last 40 years, Democrats have been afraid of touting big government out of fear of being called socialist, out of fear of possibly bringing back the bad old days of the 1970s. Now the Democratic Party certainly has shifted to the left, and Biden, hoping to lead that party and having succeeded in leading the party, has shifted with them.
So many more questions about this. I'm just going to ask you one final one,
Sure.
which is, as you mentioned, Jake, we are in a different time period now than some of these other presidents. How do economists feel overall about this overarching question about government spending, the national debt, and how the Biden administration is hoping to propel economic growth?
So some economists think it's a great idea, and those are the economists that the Biden administration certainly wheels out in support of its plans. Some economists are worried about this, and certainly conservative and Republican economists, I think, are worried about government getting too big, focusing again on government solutions. Interestingly, some Democratic economists have raised concerns, most famously Larry Summers, who was Bill Clinton's Treasury Secretary, Barack Obama's chairman of the director of the National Economic Council, who has also warned that if the Biden administration isn't careful, you could bring us back to the high inflation of the 1970s with some of the mistakes that were made in Lyndon Johnson's Great Society that you had alluded to earlier.
Jacob Schlesinger, thank you.
Thank you.